The hallway outside the club was quieter than it should have been for a Friday night in Las Vegas. The muffled hum of laughter and clinking glasses from the main showroom faded the farther one walked from the spotlight, until only the dull echo of footsteps remained. Sammy Davis Jr. stood at the end of that hallway, staring at a door that wasn't marked for performers or guests. It was just a plain door. No gold trim. No velvet rope. No applause waiting on the other side. He had learned early in his career, the most important moments rarely happened on stage. Sammy adjusted his jacket slowly, carefully. He always did that when he needed time to think. The jacket fit perfectly tailored, elegant, expensive. It was proof of success, proof that he belonged. But the weight he felt in his chest had nothing to do with fabric or fame. It came from experience, from knowing that rooms like this one could change a night, or a life. 3 men had asked to see him privately, not producers, not journalists, not fans. 3 men who hadn't applauded during his performance. Inside the showroom, his final notes still echoed in people's memories. He had danced, sung, smiled, made it look effortless. The crowd had risen to their feet. Standing ovation. Champagne corks popping. For them, the night was already a success. For Sammy, the night wasn't finished. He could have declined. He had every right to. He was the headliner. He was Sammy Davis Jr., name on the marquee, a legend in the making. But experience told him that walking away sometimes carried consequences worse than staying. So he stood there, breathing evenly, listening to the faint sound of his own pulse, and knocked. The door opened slowly. The room inside was smaller than he expected. Low ceiling, one bare light hanging overhead. 3 men sat around a plain table. They weren't smiling. They weren't angry either. Their faces carried something colder. Valuation, measurement, the kind of look people give when they believe power is on their side. "Mr. Davis," one of them said, gesturing toward an empty chair. "Please, sit." Sammy did. He didn't ask questions. He didn't raise his voice. He simply sat, hands folded, posture straight. Years in show business had taught him something vital. Dignity was armor. Even when fear tried to slip underneath, the men spoke in careful tones. Polite words. Compliments laced with conditions. They talked about expectations, about image, about how certain audiences reacted to certain things. They never raised their voices. They didn't need to. Control doesn't shout, it assumes. Sammy listened. Every sentence felt like a narrowing hallway. Every pause felt intentional. What they were really saying was clear without being spoken. You are welcome here. As long as you stay within boundaries we define. It wasn't the first time Sammy had heard versions of this conversation. He had grown up navigating rooms where talent was applauded, but presence was questioned. He had learned how to smile while swallowing anger, how to dance past discomfort, how to survive without letting bitterness take the wheel. But tonight felt different. Tonight, something felt final. One of the men leaned forward slightly. "We want to avoid misunderstandings," he said. "You understand how things work?" Sammy nodded slowly. He did understand. Too well. What none of the men noticed, too focused on their authority, was the silence outside the room shifting. Footsteps approached. Unhurried. Familiar. Dean. Martin had finished his drink at the bar minutes earlier. Dean had been watching the room all night, as he always did. Not from the stage, not from the spotlight, but from the edges. He noticed who laughed too hard, who didn't clap, who stared a second too long when Sammy walked by. Dean noticed things most people missed. He always had. When Sammy didn't return after the show, Dean didn't ask the manager. He didn't make a scene. He simply stood up, straightened his jacket, and walked down the hallway. Dean Martin didn't believe in loud heroics. He believed in timing. He stopped outside the unmarked door, listened, heard voices that were too calm, too controlled. He smiled faintly, not amused, not angry, just resolved. Then he opened the door without knocking. The room froze. All 3 men turned at once. Surprise flickered across their faces, before they masked it with practiced politeness. Dean stepped inside like he owned the place, because in many ways he did. His presence changed the temperature of the room instantly, not through force, but through certainty. "Evening, boys," Dean said casually. "I hope I'm not interrupting anything important." Sammy looked up. For a brief second, something crossed his face. Relief, gratitude, disbelief. He hadn't called for help. He hadn't expected it. But there Dean was, calm, unbothered, standing exactly where he needed to be. One of the men cleared his throat. "Mr. Martin, this is a private conversation." Dean glanced at Sammy, then back at the men. His smile never faded. "Funny thing about private conversations," he said lightly. "They shouldn't make a man look like he's being cornered." Silence. Dean pulled out a chair and sat beside Sammy without asking permission. Close enough that their shoulders nearly touched. Close enough to make a statement without saying it aloud. "You see," Dean continued, folding his hands on the table, "this gentleman here isn't just a performer. He's family. And family doesn't sit alone in rooms like this." The men exchanged glances. The balance had shifted, and they felt it. Dean Martin wasn't loud. He wasn't threatening. He didn't need to be. His reputation walked into the room before he did. Sammy said nothing. He didn't need to. For the first time that night, the men hesitated. And that hesitation, small, almost invisible, was the beginning of everything changing. The room did not grow louder after Dean Martin sat down. It grew smaller. The kind of small that presses against the ribs and makes even confident men adjust their collars without realizing it. The bare bulb overhead hummed faintly, as if it too were unsure whose side it was on. Sammy Davis Jr. felt the shift immediately, not relief exactly. Not yet, but something rarer. The sudden understanding. The weight he'd been carrying was no longer his alone. One of the men cleared his throat again, this time with less certainty. He leaned back in his chair, folding his arms as though posture alone could reclaim control. "Mr. Martin," he said carefully, "this conversation concerns professional arrangements. Nothing more." Dean's eyes didn't leave the man's face. They were calm, almost lazy, but there was precision behind them. "Funny," Dean replied, voice smooth as polished glass, "because when professionals talk business, nobody looks trapped." Sammy felt it then, that word hanging in the air. Trapped. He hadn't said it himself, not once. He had learned long ago that naming a thing gave it power. But Dean had named it effortlessly, without fear, without apology. And now it existed in the room, undeniable. The second man leaned forward, trying a different tone, softer, reasonable. "We respect Mr. Davis tremendously. He's talented. No one's questioning that." Dean tilted his head slightly, as if listening to music only he could hear. "Then why does respect sound like a warning?" Silence answered him. Sammy's mind drifted not away from the room, but deeper into it. He remembered other rooms, other closed doors, other men who spoke in half sentences and smiled while drawing invisible lines he wasn't supposed to cross. He remembered being younger, hungrier, grateful for any opportunity at all. Back then, silence had been survival. Tonight, silence felt like surrender. Dean shifted in his chair, leaning closer to the table. Not aggressively, deliberately. "Let me save us all some time," he said. "You're worried about perception. About what happens if certain people see certain things. You think pressure solves that?" The third man finally spoke, his voice sharper than the others. "We think stability solves it." Dean smiled then, a small curve of the mouth that never reached his eyes. "Stability," he repeated. "That's an interesting word to use when you're trying to bend someone." Sammy's fingers tightened together under the table. His heartbeat was steady, but his chest felt tight. He wasn't afraid, not in the simple sense. What he felt was the old exhaustion of always having to be acceptable, always having to prove that excellence was enough. Dean straightened slightly and turned toward Sammy for the first time since entering the room. His voice softened, not weaker, just warmer. "You okay, pal?" Sammy met his gaze. There were 1,000 answers he could have given. Years of stories, decades of compromise. Instead, he gave the truest one. "I will be." That was all Dean needed. He turned back to the men, and something in his posture changed. The ease was still there, the casual confidence, but now there was finality beneath it. "Here's what's going to happen," Dean said calmly. "This meeting ends. My friend here walks out with me. And tomorrow, nobody remembers this room ever existed." The men stiffened. "That's not how this works," one of them said quickly. Dean nodded. "That's exactly how it works. You just forgot who makes the lights stay on." The words weren't loud. They didn't need to be. Influence, when real, never raises its voice. It waits. One man stood abruptly, chair scraping the floor. "Are you threatening us?" Dean remained seated. He looked up at the man, unbothered. "No, I'm reminding you. There's a difference." For a moment, it felt like the room might crack under the tension. Sammy sensed it, the instinctive calculation behind the men's eyes, the silent weighing of consequences. They had expected compliance. They had prepared for resistance. What they hadn't prepared for was unity. That was the dangerous thing. The standing man slowly sat back down. Dean exhaled softly as if concluding a pleasant conversation. "We all want the same thing," he said. "Good shows. Full houses. Happy audiences. You get that by letting artists breathe, not by putting them in boxes." He rose then, finally, adjusting his jacket with the same casual grace he'd walked in with. He placed a hand briefly on Sammy's shoulder. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't for show. It was a quiet declaration. "You're not alone." They walked toward the door. Together, no one stopped them. The hallway outside felt longer than before, but lighter too. The distant sound of laughter from the showroom drifted toward them again, as if nothing had happened. As if everything hadn't just changed. Sammy stopped once they were out of sight. He leaned against the wall, breath steady, but eyes distant. Dean waited. Didn't rush him. Didn't fill the silence. "You didn't have to do that," Sammy said finally. Dean shrugged. "Yeah," he replied. "I did." Sammy looked at him then. Really looked at him. Not the star. Not the Rat Pack icon. The man. "You know this will cost you," he said quietly. Dean's smile returned, this time genuine. "Some things cost more if you don't pay them." They stood there for a moment longer. Two men in a hallway history would never record. No cameras. No headlines. Just a choice made and owned. Neither of them knew yet that this moment, this quiet stand would ripple outward, that others would notice, that doors would open and close because of what happened in that unmarked room. But power had shifted, and it wouldn't be silent for long. By morning, the hallway outside that unmarked door felt like a dream, too quiet, too clean, as if it had erased itself the moment Dean and Sammy walked away. But rooms don't forget, people do. And the people who don't forget are the ones who start watching. Sammy woke before sunrise. The city still half asleep, neon signs buzzing like tired insects beyond the hotel window. He sat on the edge of the bed, jacket draped over a chair, shoes untouched. The applause from the night before had already faded. But the silence that followed Dean's intervention hadn't. It lingered. It pressed. It asked a question Sammy had avoided his whole life. What happens next when you stop bending? He washed his face, steadying himself, and stared into the mirror. The reflection looked the same sharp suit, practiced confidence, but something inside had shifted. For the first time, he wasn't calculating the cost alone. Across town, Dean was already awake too. He sat at a small table with black coffee growing cold, reading the paper without turning a single page. He wasn't worried, not in the usual sense. He knew how power reacted when challenged quietly. First came denial, then pressure, then consequences dressed up as coincidence. He had lived long enough to recognize the pattern. The phone rang. Mid-morning. Dean answered without checking who it was. Dean came a familiar voice, smooth, careful, pretending the call was casual. "Heard you had a lively night." Dean smiled faintly. "Depends on your definition of lively." There was a pause. Just long enough to confirm what the call really was. Some people think you overstepped, the voice said. You put yourself in the middle of something delicate. Dean leaned back in his chair. Funny. From where I was sitting, someone else crossed a line first. Another pause. Longer this time. We don't want trouble, the voice said finally. Dean's tone never changed. Neither do I. That's why I stop it early. The call ended shortly after. No threats. No agreements. Just the unspoken acknowledgement that the chessboard had been disturbed by evening. The city felt different. Sammy sensed it the moment he walked into the venue. The staff was polite, too polite. Smiles lingered a fraction too long. Conversations stopped when he passed. Word hadn't spread publicly, not yet, but it had traveled in whispers, in glances. In careful distance, Dean found him near the wings before the show. You ready? Dean asked. Sammy nodded. More than I thought. Dean studied him for a moment. Good. Tonight's important. The curtain rose. The lights hit hard, bright, unforgiving, honest. Sammy stepped into them, microphone in hand, heart steady. He sang the opening notes slowly, deliberately, letting each word breathe. The audience leaned in. They always did. But tonight there was something else, a tension they couldn't name, feeling that this performance mattered beyond entertainment. Midway through the set, Sammy paused, not long. Just enough, he looked out over the crowd, thousands of faces, reflecting anticipation, curiosity, warmth. He didn't make a speech. He didn't call attention to himself. Instead, he smiled, small, genuine, said, Sometimes the people who stand beside you, when no one's watching, matter more than the applause. A ripple moved through the room. From the side of the stage, Dean watched. He didn't step forward, not yet. This wasn't his moment to speak. It was his moment to be seen without saying a word. Sammy finished the song to thunderous applause. Then something unexpected happened. Dean walked onto the stage. No announcement. No cue. Just a familiar silhouette stepping into the light. The room erupted, not in surprise, but recognition. This was the Rat Pack. This was history. This was together. Dean took the microphone, waited for the noise to settle, then placed a hand lightly on Sammy's shoulder. Ladies and gentlemen, Dean said, voice easy but firm, talent is something you applaud. Character is something you stand for. He paused. Let it land. I stand here tonight with a man who's got both. The crowd rose as one. Not because they understood the full story, but because they felt the truth in the moment. Unity has a frequency people recognize instinctively. Backstage, faces tightened. Some smiled nervously. Some looked away. Power doesn't like being exposed in light. It doesn't control. After the show, the invitations slowed. Meetings were postponed. A door or two quietly closed. Sammy noticed. Dean did too. Neither of them commented on it. Instead, something else happened. Artists began stopping Sammy in hallways, not to congratulate him on his performance, but to thank him, quietly, privately. That mattered, they said. What you did mattered. They didn't explain. They didn't need to. Dean received fewer calls, but the ones he did get sounded different. More careful. More respectful, because the industry had seen something it couldn't ignore. Not rebellion. Alignment. One night later, as they stood together outside the venue, the city lights stretching endlessly before them, Sammy spoke softly. They're watching us now. Dean nodded. Good. Let him. Sammy exhaled. You think this changes anything? Dean looked out over the city, eyes thoughtful. It already has. People just don't know it yet. Above them, the neon flickered unstable, imperfect, bright, and somewhere behind closed doors. Plans were being rewritten, because once power realizes it's no longer alone in the dark, it starts to fear the light. The pressure did not arrive loudly. It never did. It arrived disguised as silence, as delayed phone calls, as schedules that suddenly changed without explanation. For 2 days after the show, Sammy felt it everywhere, in the polite distance of venue managers, in the careful smiles of executives who once greeted him warmly, Nothing was said outright. Nothing needed to be. The message was being delivered the way power always preferred, indirectly. Deniably, patiently. Dean felt it too, but Dean had lived long enough to know that silence was not always absence. Sometimes it was a gathering breath. The third night was supposed to be routine. Another packed house. Another flawless performance. Another step forward. Instead, it arrived heavy with expectation, like the air before a storm. Backstage, the hallway hummed with nervous energy. Crew members avoided eye contact. Conversations dropped when Dean walked past. Someone had decided something, but no one knew exactly what. Sammy stood alone in his dressing room, staring at his reflection. He had performed in front of presidents, kings, crowds that stretched farther than memory. Yet tonight felt different. Tonight, it wasn't his voice being tested. It was his resolve. There was a knock. Dean didn't wait for an answer. He stepped inside, closed the door gently behind him, and leaned against it for a moment as if listening to the world outside. "They're making their move," he said quietly. Sammy nodded. "I can feel it. I want you to step back," Dean continued. "Not off the stage. Just out of the way." Sammy laughed once, softly, not amused. "I've stepped back my whole life." Dean straightened. "Not tonight." The announcement came minutes before curtain. A manager entered, flanked by two men Sammy had never seen before. Smiles tight. Voices controlled. "There's been a change," the manager said. "We're adjusting the order of performances." Sammy understood instantly. He was being repositioned, reduced, hidden without being removed. Dean didn't raise his voice. He didn't argue. He simply stepped forward. "No," he said. The word landed hard. The manager blinked. "Excuse me?" Dean's tone remained calm, but there was no room left in it. "Sammy goes on as planned. Or I don't go on at all." Silence spread like spilled ink. "You can't," the manager started. Dean held up a hand. "You can explain it to the audience. Or to the press. Or to the people who paid to see us. Your choice." This was the moment power had not planned for. They had expected resistance from Sammy. They had prepared for that. What they hadn't prepared for was refusal from someone they could not easily replace. The men withdrew to whisper. Minutes passed. The clock ticked loudly on the wall. Finally, the manager returned, face pale. "Proceed as scheduled." Dean didn't smile. He just nodded and turned to Sammy. "Let's go." When the curtain rose, the audience felt it immediately. Something electric moved through the room, anticipation sharpened by tension they couldn't name. Sammy stepped into the light first. The applause hit harder than before, louder, more insistent, as if the crowd itself sensed defiance. He sang like a man unburdened. Every note carried weight. Every pause held meaning. He wasn't performing for approval anymore. He was performing from truth. When he finished, the ovation didn't stop. People stood, clapped, shouted his name. Then Dean walked out. Not beside him, behind him. He waited until the applause peaked, and placed himself just one step back, letting the crowd see it clearly. Not dominance. Not ownership. Support. Dean took the microphone slowly. The room fell silent. "People think courage looks loud," he said. "Like shouting. Like fists in the air." He glanced at Sammy, "But real courage looks like standing still when someone wants you to disappear." The words struck deep. Dean continued, voice steady. "This man has done that his whole life. Tonight, I'm just making sure nobody pretends they don't see him." For a heartbeat, no one moved. Then the room exploded. It wasn't just applause. It was recognition. People were standing not because they were told to, but because something inside them demanded it. Backstage, doors closed quietly. Phones rang unanswered. Plans dissolved. Because the industry had just learned. Something dangerous control only works when people accept it alone. Later that night, after the crowd had gone and the lights dimmed, Dean and Sammy stood at the edge of the empty stage. The silence now felt earned, not imposed. "They won't forget this," Sammy said. Dean nodded. "Good." Neither will you. Sammy turned to him. You changed the rules. Dean shook his head. No. I reminded them there are rules. Years later, people would tell the story wrong. They would make it louder, cleaner, easier. They would turn it into myth. But the truth was quieter and stronger. A man was cornered. Another man sat beside him. And power blinked. That was all it took.